So continuing on with the discussion about null hypotheses. So again, the example that I was just giving in the part 1 video was if your research question is, does food insecurity impact the academic well-being of first generation students differently as compared to non-first generation college students? If that is your research question, then your hypothesis could be food insecurity impacts the academic well-being of first-gen students differently as compared to non-first generation students. In that case, your null hypothesis would be there is no differential impact of food insecurity on the academic well-being of first-generation students as compared to non-first-generation students. So again, the null hypothesis is essentially saying that there is no difference between two groups, or essentially saying that there was no impact of a certain construct on another. In this case, again, looking at food insecurity. We will talk about hypotheses more in our next lecture, and we will again then touch again on the difference between a hypothesis and a null hypothesis. So that all fell under the research step 2. So the first step again is posing your research question. The next step is reviewing the literature on that topic. Then you will proceed to refine your research question, or if you so desire, transform your research question into a hypothesis. Then in step 4, you're going to conceptualize your study. You are going to figure out how you are actually going to conduct that study. Is your study going to be exploratory, explanatory, descriptive, evaluative? Are you going to use surveys, interviews, focus groups? Who are your research participants going to be? How are you going to recruit these people? All of those things go into conceptualizing your study. And that is part 4. And then finally in part 5, you're going to collect and analyze your data. So again, over the course of the next 2 semesters, we are going to go through all 5 of these steps. And actually during this first semester, we will go through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we'll complete all of that by Christmas. And then next semester, we will focus on collecting and analyzing the data and then writing up your findings. Okay, so now let's move on to the purpose of empirical research studies. So empirical research studies, and again, just to revisit what we started this lecture off with, an empirical study just means that you are analyzing data with the intent of answering your research question, of gaining knowledge. So empirical research studies can have different purposes. There are different reasons to conduct empirical research. The first one is exploration. So if you have found a brand new topic that other people have not yet studied, then you're essentially exploring that topic. So you can conduct an empirical study that's exploratory in nature. Usually exploratory studies have a small sample size, and as a result, you're not going to be able to generalize your findings beyond your own sample. So again, an exploratory study, the purpose is to explore a new topic that not many people have looked at or no people have looked at up until this point. And generally when you do exploratory research, your sample size is pretty small. You're only going to be collecting data from a small number of people. It's really your first step in learning more about that topic. A second purpose of empirical research would be descriptive. So descriptive studies usually have larger sample sizes, and they are trying to describe a population. That data is generally collected through surveys, because if you're trying to get a large sample size, it is easiest to collect quantitative data, and a lot of times that's accomplished through surveys. Descriptive studies are very concerned with having representative data. So in other words, they want to try to make sure that their study's sample looks like the population from which the sample was drawn. So for instance, if I want to get a sample that's representative of NKU's student body, if I were to only sample social work students, that would not be a representative sample. Let's say, for instance, I'm looking at, I want to examine the political viewpoints of NKU students. if I only collect data on the political viewpoints of our social work students, very likely that data is not going to be representative of our overall NKU student body. So if you wanted to conduct a descriptive study on the political viewpoints of NKU students, you're going to have to make sure that you collect data from a pretty significant sample of NKU students, and that sample is being drawn, those student participants are being drawn from colleges, from all 6 colleges on NKU's campus, not just one program like social work. So again, descriptive studies have larger sample sizes. They seek to describe a population. They usually use surveys, and they are very concerned with how representative their sample is of the entire population that they are interested in. Descriptive studies do not seek to examine the relationship between variables. So they're not looking at the impact of one variable or not on another. They're not looking at the relationship between 2 variables. They're just looking at describing a population. So that means that in a descriptive study, you don't have independent and dependent variables. You're just looking at describing a population. So again, an example would be that you would try to describe the political viewpoints of all NKU students. The next purpose of empirical research can be explanatory. So some empirical studies seek to explain a particular phenomenon. Rather than simply describing a phenomenon, they are wanting to explain it. In these types of studies, there's often a use of a control group, also known as a comparison group. So you're comparing a group that is receiving an intervention, for instance, with a group that's not receiving an intervention. And in doing so, you're trying to explain why a certain phenomenon is occurring. These studies do look at the influence of one variable on another variable. They look at the influence of your independent variable on your dependent variable. So again, explanatory studies are trying to explain a phenomenon. And then the last purpose of empirical research is to evaluate. So evaluation studies seek to evaluate social policies, programs, interventions. So they're really looking at the effectiveness of a program, the effectiveness of a policy, or the impact of a policy. The evaluation studies do then look at the influence of an independent variable on a dependent variable. So if you're looking at a smoking cessation program and you're trying to see how effective is that program at actually reducing smoking habits among a particular population. So in that case, you're looking at the impact of your smoking cessation program on smoking habits. So the independent variable is the cessation program, and the smoking habits is your dependent variable. So that would be an example of an evaluation study. So again, these 4 are the main 4 purposes of empirical research. Again, it can be exploratory, where you're looking at a brand new topic. It can be descriptive, where you're trying to describe a population. It can be explanatory, where you're trying to explain a certain phenomena. Or it can be evaluative, where you're trying to evaluate a social policy, a program, or an intervention. Now we're going to move on to looking at peer-reviewed articles. We're going to look at what are peer-reviewed articles, what are different types of articles that get published in peer-reviewed journals, where can you find peer-reviewed articles, and then we'll very briefly talk about APA formatting as well. So when we think about peer-reviewed articles, these are articles that are published in peer-reviewed journals. What that means is if I want to publish an article in a peer-reviewed journal, what I've had to do then is I will submit my article to a journal that I feel is relevant to the topic. So for instance, if I have, let's see, I'm currently in the process of getting an article published in the Journal of Black Studies, and the article that I'm publishing has to do with the use of team-based learning and whether or not team-based learning is effective for Black students who are attending predominantly white universities. And so I submitted my article to the Journal of Black Studies. The editor of that journal then sent my article out to 2 reviewers. When my article went to those 2 reviewers, it was blinded, and that means that my name was removed from the article. So when the reviewers get the article, they do not know who I am and they do not know what university I'm representing. So they read the article without knowing that information. Those 2 reviewers then give feedback to the editor, and they will say, okay, we think usually you get one of 3 responses. Either they outright accept it, which is extremely rare, or they outright reject it, more common, or they'll say, we think this is a great article with a lot of potential, but we would like to see some revisions. That's referred to as a revise and resubmit. So that's currently the stage that I'm in. I received a revise and resubmit. I made revisions and have meanwhile resubmitted it, and I'm waiting to hear back from them. So what that means is that if you have an article that has been published in a peer-reviewed journal, then you know that that article and the quality of that article has been vetted by at least 2 individuals who have expertise in that area. So that then tells you something about the quality of that article. You know that that article has a high level of quality. Now, aside from these peer-reviewed articles, and I should also add, to get through that peer-reviewed process, to get an article published from start to finish takes at least a year. So that's very important to know, that this is a lengthy process, and it does give you some assurances as the consumer of that article. When you're reading that article, it gives you some assurances that it is a good quality article. Now, aside from peer-reviewed articles, you can also use other reputable sources. Really great sources of information can be government websites, and then also reputable organizations or agencies, like, for instance, hospice. You want to stay away from citing sources or using sources that are more biased. So there are certain agencies that they have their own agenda, and so you want to ensure that whatever data you're using or information you're using from their website, that that information is legitimate. What are some different types of research articles that get published in peer-reviewed journals? So in a peer-reviewed journal, you can find different types of articles. Empirical studies, which is what we spent the first part of this lecture talking about, so empirical studies that gathered, they used data, they analyzed the data, and then reported on their findings. Empirical studies are very common in peer-reviewed journals. And again, just like I said earlier on, those empirical studies can either involve the analysis of primary or secondary data. Again, primary data refers to data that you collected specifically for the purpose of your study. Secondary data refers to data that somebody else collected or even you collected, but for purposes other than your study, but you are now using them to answer your research question. Aside from empirical studies, you can also find theoretical or conceptual studies in peer-reviewed journals. So those studies pose a hypothesis, and they then attempt to support that hypothesis using theory. These types of studies and articles do not have any data in them. They don't have any analytical findings in them. They just focus on answering or supporting their hypothesis through use of theory. Then another type of research article that you find in peer-reviewed journals is literature reviews. So these are articles that in and of themselves are a full-blown literature review. The only purpose of those articles is to provide an exhaustive overview of everything that's already been published on that particular topic. These articles tend to be very lengthy, usually somewhere around 25 or more pages, and they usually have a very extensive reference list. So we're talking, depending on the topic, anywhere around 100 sources. So it's an extremely lengthy process to write and publish a literature review. And then the last type of article that you could find in a peer-reviewed journal is a meta-analysis. Meta-analyses are quite complicated to read, and they will combine the findings from previously conducted empirical studies, and they're going to try to figure out if those findings are consistent with one another. So they want to know if you have articles looking at child sexual abuse